Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Andrew Stratalities with the Red Pill Religion podcast. Today we have Dan Barker from the Freedom from Religion Foundation and Josh Brister, and they will be discussing Christianity versus atheism. Where does the evidence lie? Please, if you enjoyed this broadcast, remember to subscribe, give us a like, and you can always find us at redpillreligion.com. So, Dan, who is our guest, will be able to start and go ahead and give a summary of his position. Just to note, Dan, your video camera is on at this moment. If,
How do I turn it off?
there should be a button on the top that shows a little camera symbol with a line through it, and if you click that, that should turn it off.
I think that did it.
Yeah, hold on. Well, I don't see where that is, but it's not hurting anything, is it?
No, it's not.
All right, as long as you can hear me okay.
Okay.
Well, thank you guys, Andrew and Josh, for the invitation. So, I used to be a Christian preacher, and I was convinced that the evidence for Christianity was sound, that it was overwhelming. And I spent 19 years preaching the gospel. I loved it. I believed it. I felt it. I saw what I was convinced were answers to prayer. I felt what I was convinced was the Spirit. I read the Bible regularly. And so, the resurrection of Jesus, I thought, was really powerful. I thought that was, something that you can actually put on the table besides just arguing and having arguments for or against. I thought there was historical evidence for Christianity. And so now, of course, I changed my mind and I wrote some books about it. The most popular is called Godless: Why an Evangelical Preacher Became One of America's Leading Atheists. And we don't have time today, but in the book, I pretty much spell out why I changed my mind. It was painful. It was awkward. After so many years of deeply committing your life to the truth of Christianity and the love of Jesus and all of that, the hope of eternal life and the remission of sins, to admit that I was wrong, to admit painfully that Christianity basically is not the truth. It is not right. It does have some truth in it. All religions do, of course. It even has some beauty in it, and all religions do have some beauty in it, of course. But Christianity, I learned, was just not tenable. The Bible is not a reliable guide to truth, or especially to morality. The Bible is a horrible moral guide. And it's amazing how when you take the scales off your eyes, I guess, and you look at it a different way, not as a loyal defender believer, but just look at it as any person would look at any other book. It's amazing how you see all these things you didn't see before when I was a preacher. And so I would say I'm convinced God doesn't exist for many reasons, and I'll explain them very briefly here because we don't have much time. But I'm also convinced that if that God did exist, he doesn't, he's a fiction, but if he did exist, that God of the Bible, we have a moral obligation to denounce that God. We have an obligation to say he is a bad creature. He is nobody, he's not worthy of my admiration, much less my worship. But that's getting ahead of the story, obviously, because it is possible that God exists, but he's not a good God. He's a horrible, evil creature. He's a moral monster. But that's getting ahead, of course, because he doesn't exist at all. So my basic worldview here is what the worldview that we all have as human beings. We are natural organisms in a natural environment. And I think Josh and I agree with that. I mean, we have physical bodies and we eat physical food and we need sleep and we have sex and we avoid predation and we need shelter and we need to avoid the cold and disease, all that stuff. We're basically animals. At heart, we are natural animals in a natural environment. But people who believe in God are asserting something above and beyond what we both agree with. most of us atheists would say we are animals and that's it. And that's great. That's actually wonderful. And that's enough. It's more than enough. But theists are saying, yeah, we are natural creatures, but we are more than that. We are animals plus. The plus could be spiritual or soul or transcendent or supernatural or whatever you want to call it, something above and beyond the natural world. But I think it's kind of obvious. If there's anything that's obvious, it's that this supernatural world is not obvious. This God is not obvious. Because if it were, why are we even having a debate? Why are we structuring these arguments and talking about evidences and proofs? If there is this God that I used to believe in, then why do I need Josh to explain it to me? Why do I need theists and apologists and scholars and experts and preachers to explain it to me like there's a middle person between me and some above world? Why doesn't this being just simply make himself real and known to me? And of course, I used to preach that he did through Jesus, but that's just a story. That's just basically a story. So I think exhibit number one in this debate is the fact that we're even having a debate. Atheism is not a religion. Atheism is not some alternative stance. Like if you were to picture all of the religions of the world as a sort of a TV menu of channels, you could pick Buddhism or Roman Catholicism, or you could pick Native American spirituality, or you could pick Hindus or whatever. If you had this long list of religions, atheism would not be on that list. Atheism is the off button. Turn off the TV. Turn around and look at the real world. Atheism is the default natural position that we all live our lives in, whether you're a believer or not. And so the burden of proof is not on the atheist. The burden of proof is on the person who makes the additional claim above and beyond what we both agree with. So I don't have anything to prove. I'm kind of like a defense attorney in a trial. The prosecution has to make the case, has to prove the case, put the evidence on the table, show the body, show the murder weapon, show the evidence, show the photograph. The prosecution has that burden. The defense doesn't. The defense only has to show reasonable doubt. So I'm an atheist really kind of for 7 basic reasons that show reasonable doubt, and they are all absences. They are not evidences. They are basically absences of things. The first one is an absence of a coherent definition of a God. The second one is the absence of an agreement among believers about this God. You don't have to be an expert to know that all the experts disagree with each other. In these religions and denominations, they're fighting holy wars, and they even kill each other over petty little doctrinal differences. They can't even get their act together, even though Paul told us in the New Testament, you should all be of one mind and let there be no disagreement among you. But I can't think of any book that's caused more disagreement than the Bible. If believers want to make a case to us non-believers, you should first get your act together and agree on some kind of, a definition of this being. How much does it weigh? Where does it live? What is it like? How do you contact it? And then, of course, its moral principles. Third, there's a lack of a good argument. There's cosmological, design arguments, moral arguments, ontological. Bertrand Russell said that these arguments basically just boil down to bad grammar. When you scratch beneath the surface, they're not really good arguments for God. And why would God even need arguments? The very fact that he needs arguments means that he's inept. He's incapable of making himself known to us. Another lack is the good reply to the problem of evil. And I like to say during my public debates that all you have to do is walk into any children's hospital and there's no God, or at least there's no good God, because prayer, even though the Bible promises that all things whatsoever ye shall ask in my name, believing, you shall receive, in real life, prayer comes down to nothing better than random chance. People are praying for their children and they die. Their prayers are not answered, but occasionally one prayer is answered, and praise God, that was a miracle, right? When basically that was just statistics. Then there's a lack of a need for a God. Tens of millions of really good people in this country alone, hundreds of millions on the planet, live really good lives without believing in God. We're happy, we're moral, we're loving, we have our families, we have purpose in our lives, we have meaning, we have productivity, we have hope in our lives. We don't need this God belief. And if you don't need it, it's just getting in the way of living a good, full, happy life. And finally, for me, the Bible, the lack of a reliability of these holy scriptures. And the Bible is not only contradictory, it's not only in many places unscientific and in many places unhistorical, is written by a bunch of primitive, ancient, patriarchal Israelites who thought they knew what the world was all about. And you and I are not beholden to those guys. But it also lacks any real moral guidance. It is a horrible moral guide for our lives. Any one of us could do much better than that. So you take all of those lacks together, those absences together, and you come up with the absence of a belief in a God, which is what atheism basically is. Atheism is sort of the happy default position as a normal biological organism in a natural environment. And I will stop there.
Okay, Josh, can you please summarize your position for this discussion?
Well, I do appreciate it very much, Dan. Thank you for giving all that information on why you don't believe. But I did want to mention a lot of your 7 points seem to show that atheism is the default position. That's not how professional atheistic philosophers like Dr. Graham Oppy understand this. Let me read another atheistic philosopher, Cal Neeson. He says, to show that an argument is invalid or unsound is not to show that the conclusion of the argument is false. All the proofs of God's existence may fail, but it still may be the case that God exists. In short, to show that the proofs do not work is not enough in itself. It may still be the case that God exists. And he said that in Reason and Practice, his book Reason and Practice. Let me start with this. Man, writes Lauren Isley, is the cosmic orphan. He is the only creature in the universe who asks why. Other creatures have instincts to guide them, but man has learned to ask questions. Who am I? Man asks. Why am I here? Where am I going? You see, Dan, I think a few of your 7 points. You mentioned why kids die in hospitals. Well, me personally, I went through a car accident. I was in a coma for a month, and I think the things associated with that, which I've never told anybody, do point to a miracle. In fact, tomorrow I'm going to interview Lydia McGrew. Her book Hidden in Plain Sight. It's kind of a second volume to William Paley's Evidences for Christianity, that show that when there's historical evidence and when you have these things in their totality, when Jesus says something, for example, let them walk, or get up and take and leave from here. You have to put 2 and 2 together and use common sense and say, perhaps there's a divine miracle on our hands. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, Dan, but on April 8th, 1966, Time magazine ran with an issue, Is God Dead? On its cover. But just as Time had raised the question of God's existence in light of the supposed death of God, and which pronounced God altogether dead the next year, a remarkable change took place, Dan. Merely a few years later, Time ran on its cover, Is God coming back to life? Now, during the last quarter century, a remarkable revolution has occurred in American philosophy. This change was so noteworthy that even the popular media observed it. In an article entitled Modernizing the Case for God, published on April 7, 1980, Time magazine commented, in a quiet revolution in thought and argument that hardly anybody could have foreseen only 2 decades ago, God is making a comeback. Most intriguingly, this is happening not among theologians or ordinary believers, but in the crisp intellectual circles of academic philosophers, where the consensus has long banished the Almighty from fruitful discussion. Quentin Smith, an atheistic philosopher, has said basically the same things. This is what he said. God is not dead in academia. He returned to life in the mid-60s and is now alive and well in his last academic stronghold, philosophy departments. Now, you mentioned a few things that seem to sound like you're arguing from a verificationist type perspective, or saying that we must presume atheism. No, we must have an open heart and an open mind and look at the evidence. Now, what is the evidence that hits our sense organs and what we must interpret? Well, you have the cosmological argument. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Now, if you ask what God's cause is, you're simply arguing back a circle. You have to come to a stopping point. Now, if you say, why can't the universe become that stopping point? In his famous debate with Bertrand Russell, who you quoted, Frederick Copleston didn't have an answer to that. But guess what, Dan? Modern cosmology points that the universe began to exist. It's not the necessary thing that exists. You also have the contingency argument by Gottfried Leibniz that says anything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. Premise 2, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. So if you have a contingent thing like our universe, there must be a necessary being, necessary something for why it exists. Since the universe, in all parts that came into it, came about at the Big Bang, it cannot be the necessary thing. You also have the moral argument. Dan, for you to even say that certain things are wrong, for example, kids dying in hospitals, you're presupposing some standard of right and wrongness. So, apart from showing that God doesn't exist, you're actually presupposing some objective standard that transcends the cultural milieu in which to make that pronouncement. You also have the argument from intentionality, where we have free will. If you're going to argue against free will, I can simply quote to you G.A. Moore, the late early 20th century philosopher, who wrote in his article, A Defense of Common Sense, that it's so apparent that we have free will. And for this, he gave an example of where he could raise his hand and says, there. And then he raises his hand again and says, there, I did it again. Free will is intuitively obvious to us. We also have the fine-tuning argument that shows that the very constants and quantities put at the beginning of the universe show or plausibly show the appearance of design. Now, are you going to say we can't trust our sensory perceptions of the external world, Dan? I hope not. Also, lastly, I think we have the resurrection of Jesus. I think this is a very good argument. There was a philosopher in the 18th century. This is what he said. His name is Thomas Reid from the Common Sense Realism School. He said, we see then that Mr. Hume's philosophy is very much like a hobby horse, which a man when he is ill can keep with him at home and ride to his contentment. But just in case he should bring it to the marketplace, his friends would quickly impanel a jury and confiscate his estates and never have the solicitude to leave him alone again. I think that's very akin to your overall argument against Christian theism. Even though it's possible that God doesn't exist and Christianity is false, all the arguments work as signposts pointing to the fact that God did raise Jesus from the dead. I don't think we have any epistemic grounds for denying that. And I think everything in our being, for us wanting or for us believing in God, for all these arguments, they're a justification for why God does exist. What say you, Dan?
Thanks, Josh. So, you raise a lot of questions, basically. And that's why Bertrand Russell said that these arguments basically boil down to bad grammar. And what you did pretty eloquently and articulately is raise some questions that science has. In the ancient days, when they saw the lightning in the sky and they heard the thunder, they didn't know what that was. What is that? It was a gap in their knowledge. And so to fill that gap, this big question mark, as you said, human beings are asking why, why? To fill that gap, the ancients said, well, there must be some agency up there. We're going to call it Thor or Zeus or, whatever, the hammer of Zeus or the lightning bolt of the gods. But now that we know more about electricity and the weather patterns, those gaps have closed and those gods have died. We don't need them to fill those gaps anymore. So you're absolutely correct. There are many gaps today in scientific understanding. And in fact, it is those very gaps that are driving science. If we didn't have them, we wouldn't have any more scientific inquiry. So we actually welcome those gaps because it drives us. So gaps about the fine tuning. Victor Stenger has written a couple of great books showing that your fine tuning argument is upside down. It makes a lot of assumptions, and when you scratch beneath the surface, you see, wait a minute, these are just putting words together. The so-called the cosmological first cause argument. I wrote a whole chapter in my book called "Cosmological Calamity" with a K, referring to William Lane Craig's Kalam argument, showing this is also bad grammar. It begs the question, it's circular reasoning, it's comparing apples and oranges, and it is basically smuggling your conclusion into your argument. I wish we had time to go into all of that, but you mentioned miracles. Well, you mentioned a lot of points that I wish I could just touch on very quickly. A rebuttal is supposed to rebut point by point, isn't it? And you mentioned miracles. Obviously, if you're right about miracles, that would change everything. That would change science. That would change medicine. We wouldn't need hospitals anymore. We could just pray, like the Bible says, to get healed. But obviously, when you statistically look at the claims to miracles, you see that they are no better than random chance, or that some of them are outright frauds. Some of them are misunderstandings. So in the moral argument, it's kind of laughable. Believers like you keep raising this moral argument as if there's a moral law, there has to be a moral lawgiver, or there has to be an absolute moral standard. You don't need that. All you need to do is define morality as the intention to minimize harm in the real world. That's what morality is. There's no absolute cosmic standard out there with a capital M, morality. And when you look at the harm to sentient creatures in the real natural world, you see that a moral act is moving away from harm. And so I think you and I share that basic idea. We don't like things that harm us or that threaten us. That's basically what morality means, to avoid that. If you look at the Bible, he did things deliberately to cause harm. The genocides, the pestilence, the bloodshed, the abortion that he commanded, the cannibalism that so those are a moral justification in the real world. So those are bad things. That God of the Bible did bad things because he was causing unnecessary harm. So you're right that God is not dead, but you're not talking about a God. You're talking about the God concept. The concept of God is not dead. The Freedom from Religion Foundation, we battle this all the time. God belief is very strong, but you have to connect the dots. You can raise all these arguments, but you have to connect the dots. And so I want to talk about resurrection, but let's put that aside for a moment, because I think you wanted to say a couple of things before we go to that.
Well, yes, I did. Let me read to you a quote. This is regarding the cosmological argument. This is from not just anybody. This is from probably the world's leading physicist, the British physicist. His name is Christopher Isham. He says, quote, perhaps the best argument in favor of the thesis that the Big Bang supports theism is the obvious unease with which it is greeted by some atheist physicists. At times, this has led to scientific ideas such as continuous creation or the steady state, or an oscillating universe, being advanced with a tenacity which so exceeds their intrinsic worth that one can only suspect the operation of psychological forces lying very much deeper than the usual academic desire of a theorist to support his or her theory. I don't think you said anything about the beginning of the universe. In fact, if it, look, I think we can put it succinctly here. None of us really believes that things can pop into existence without causes. I mean, I'm sure that you study a lot for your discussions and debates. What if a kangaroo came in and started defecating on some of your books? You would not believe that for 1 second. So it seems to me that you believe the premises of the Kalam cosmological argument, and I don't see any reason why a person, for example, anybody, an atheist, would deny that. It just seems that they're doing it for ad hoc reasons. Regarding the resurrection of Jesus, um, uh, I don't think there's any good reasons for denying it. Now, if you're going to argue against the possibility of miracles, then you're going to have to give an argument for that. Just because there's one or two or three isolated miracles every now and then, that doesn't mean that we have to get rid of our understanding of science. Yet you discuss, in fact, a lot about science, but you must know, Dan, that science originated within an explicit Christian worldview. Um, Paul Davies writes, science began as an outgrowth of theology, and all scientists, whether atheists or theists, accept an essentially theological worldview. Now, I know how you love to quote Bertrand Russell, and in fact, I do too. He's brilliant. I have a few of his books, but Alfred White Northhead and Bertrand Russell were once at a conference, and it really surprised Bertrand Russell that they both wrote the Principia Mathematica. But this is what Alfred White Northhead says: I do not think, however, that I have ever yet brought out the greatest contribution of medievalism to the formation of the scientific movement. Uh, it was an inexpugnable belief that there was a secret which can be unveiled. How was this conviction been so vividly implanted on the European mind? It must come from the medieval insistence on the rationality of God, conceived as with a personal energy of Jehovah and with the rationality of Greek philosophy. Um, for science to get off the ground, you had to presuppose a rational order because God created the universe. The amazing thing is not just that the early scientists like Kepler and Galileo and Newton were explicit scientists and in fact wrote more about theology than science. The thing is that they actually discovered these laws. Their belief in progress, the belief in the rationality of the universe and laws that could be discovered, they actually found them. So it seems to me that if you're going to believe in science, you're going to have to be a Christian. The fine tuning argument, which you brought up, it's never been refuted. We're talking about the initial constants and quantities of the universe. Um, and the moral argument, you live by the moral argument as you walk through life. You don't walk through life um, purposelessly. You walk with a purpose. That's Aristotle's final cause. That's natural causation. I don't see how you can say that a moral law doesn't exist because there's instances where you simply cannot explain why God would allow a kid in a hospital to suffer. Surely that's not a good argument, Dan. Maybe the reasons for that will be explained thousands of years later. But how could you possibly know that there's a logical contradiction? That's why many philosophers have said that the logical problem of evil is fallacious. So they go to a probabilistic argument. I've said enough. What say you, Dan?
Yeah, well, you've thrown about a dozen things here. on the table. There's no way we're going to touch all of them. Did you read my article, Cosmological Calamity, where I show the bad underlying logical fallacies of the argument itself? Have you read that argument?
No, sir, but I
Okay.
will.
Well, very good. Have you read Victor Stenger's books about the fine-tuning argument, showing that basically the proponents of fine-tuning are looking at things upside down? It's kind of like, this is a simple analogy, but it's kind of like the guy who's amazed at how they made all these rivers to flow right along the state borders. How did they do that? It must have been an immense, expensive social engineering to get these rivers to divert themselves to flow right along the border perfectly. I mean, it's amazing, isn't it? Well, you can see how that's upside down thinking. It's taking the way things happen and then trying to flip it and say, well, what's the reason for that? So I didn't take notes about everything you said, but everything you did say has been thoroughly vetted. Fine-tuning argument really is making all sorts of assumptions that are unwarranted. And of course, you know that there are many theistic scientists like Paul Davies and many others who are convinced that there's a high probability that we live in a multiverse. That hasn't been proved yet. Maybe that can't even be proved. And that this particular universe that we live in, that did indeed originate with the Big Bang, this is just one of many. And of course, you know what Einstein said. Einstein said reality is space-time. Space-time is a single reality. At the Big Bang, not only did energy and matter and space come into existence, but so did time come into existence. So it is meaningless to ask what happened before the Big Bang, because it's kind of like what Stephen Hawking wrote. It'd be like asking, what is north of the North Pole? Yet some people might want to ask that. When you get to the North Pole, all the latitudes get up to zero, which we call a singularity. And then some people insist, well, keep going. What's before that? What's north of the North Pole? Well, that's a dumb question. It is bad grammar. It's a bad logical question itself. So yes, we do. Yes, we do have evidence of things coming from nothing. It's happening all the time. We do have evidence of things coming into existence without actually a cause in the quantum realm. And I'm sure you know about that, right? Before your very nose right now, there are trillions of particles, virtual particles of matter and antimatter that come into existence. There's this sort of a frothing nothingness that happens, but occasionally, like at the event horizon of a black hole, occasionally one of those particles actually goes into the black hole and one goes out, and voila, you have something from nothing. And that's what was called the Stephen Hawking radiation. So I agree with you, Josh. There are many questions. You are absolutely right. And you raise these big questions about science. But just like the ancients did with Thor and Zeus, you are doing the very same thing by plugging these modern gaps without connecting any dots, without giving any real evidence for your solution to plug these gaps. You're just plugging it in with your particular favorite God that you were raised with in your Western culture. So I agree. Atheists don't have to solve every problem. Atheists don't have any burden of proof here. All we have to show is there's a reasonable doubt that your proposed hypothesis to fill these gaps has not been proved. It's just basically words, words, and words. There's more to say, of course, but we have a very short debate today.
Yes, absolutely. And I don't think that's I don't think that is reasonable doubt that you can say that something came into existence without a cause. Let me ask. Let me quote to you again, Paul Davies, who you mentioned and which I quoted before. He says, "What caused the Big Bang? One might consider some supernatural force, some agency beyond space and time, as being responsible for the Big Bang, or one might prefer to regard the Big Bang as an event without a cause. It seems to me that we don't have too much of a choice. Either something outside the physical world or an event without a cause." And he said that in The Birth of the Cosmos. I could go on. You mentioned Stephen Hawking's. He says today, virtually everyone agrees that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. He says that in his new book, The Nature of Space and Time in 1996, his book After a Brief History of Time. You mentioned the anthropic principle. Oh, here's Barrow and Tipler. I have the book, The Anthropic Principle, by them. This is what they say. At this singularity, space and time came into existence. Literally nothing existed before the singularity. So, if the universe originated at such a singularity, we would truly have a creation ex nihilo. Now, it seems to me, Dan, that if you're going to postulate a multi-universe, you're simply going to argue against the original first cause. It's a way for atheists and others to explain not the evidence, but to explain away the apparent evidence we have for the origin and the fine tuning of the universe. So I don't see how that's reasonable at all. The theist is simply going where the evidence leads, Dan, and I don't see why a sophisticated person today would be an atheist. Now, just imagine, I have one question for you, Dan. And this was asked to Bertrand Russell, so I think it's very appropriate. If, at the end of our lives, both of us, but at the end of yours, if you were to see God, what would you say to God, Dan? Now, you have to consider this. If God does exist, he would be the locus of objective moral values and duties in the world. He would have, there would be no basis for which you to question him, it seems, because he would have the ultimate answer, that he would be the best explanation for all these things. So what would you say if you were at the footsteps of God? What would you say, Dan?
Well, of course, this is purely hypothetical, but if the Christian God exists, who is the God who created hell, basically, and I were to die and I would see that God, then whether he gave me my moral principles or not, I have them. Whether they evolved or whether he gave them to me, I have them, right? I would exercise them. And I would not hesitate to denounce that God as a moral monster according to the things that he wrote in his own book, the genocides and the infanticide and the pestilence and the misogyny and the cannibalism and the bloodthirstiness and the fire, the wrath and the anger. If you read the Bible, in fact, I think people should read the Bible. So if I saw that God, I would say, well, God, there you are, you exist, you created hell. Well, you go to hell. You're not worthy of my admiration. You are not worthy of my respect. And if I have a flawed moral judgment in saying that, well, who gave it to me? You supposedly gave it to me? Who made the rule that the creator of the universe also had to be the moral guide of the universe? Who made that rule? Perhaps there is this God. Perhaps he created everything. Perhaps he went poof and a big bang happened. Who knows? And perhaps he made the stone roll away from the tomb. But that does not follow that just because he says he's the moral arbiter, that is true. What you are asking us to do is to turn into thoughtless, brainless sheep who follow the dictator no matter what he says without exercising our own moral judgment or scientific understanding. So if he wants to send me to hell for that, if that's the kind of bully he is, because I refuse to kiss his feet and tell him how wonderful he is and how holy. If that's what he wants to do, then let him do it. Let him show what a big macho man he is by sending someone like me to hell for the crime of exercising my judgment and my moral reasoning to make these kinds of conclusions about him. That's who I am, Josh, and I'm not going to change that. I'm not going to become a sheep. I'm not going to do what the Bible says unscientifically and bring every thought into captivity unto the obedience of Christ and lean not on your own understanding, as it says in Proverbs. I'm not going to do that. I'm a rebel. I'm like the American founders. I'm going to rebel against the sovereignty, the monarchy, the the
That's
Church of
funny.
England. I'm going to do that, proudly rebel and start a revolutionary war and say, no, I'm sorry. I'm going to think for myself. And if that sends me to hell, I would go happily to hell.
You brought up the founders. I teach American history. The founders would completely disagree with you. They actually, Thomas Jefferson argued in the Declaration of Independence that we had an obligation to God, especially in the preamble to the Constitution and in the Declaration. He mentions God and the Creator numerous times. These weren't simply deists. In fact, almost all of the people that originated science, the sciences in the Enlightenment from 1530 to about 1680, with the start of Copernicus's work, 51 out of the 52 of them were either very devout Christians or or nominal Christians, which would be serious Christians today. There was, I think, one skeptic. So there was no deism or enlightenment. What I think is that, and we were talking about this earlier, before we went on air, we all have ideas, and sometimes ideas like Jordan Peterson. I don't probably don't surmise that you're a fan of Jordan Peterson, but he says sometimes ideas can control us, and I do believe that atheists believe in God. They believe in three gods. In fact, they believe in they believe in they believe in the god of power, the god of money, and the god of sex. Mars, the god of war. It's all about power, declared Nietzsche. Mammon, the god of money. Everything comes down to money, said Karl Marx. And Aphrodite, the goddess of erotic love. It's all about sex, said Freud. So I do think ideas can control people. I don't know if that would be a sufficient mantra explanation if you're at the footsteps of God. I know that you're older and that you've read a lot too, and that you're a sophisticated individual. But I would simply ask you to, to consider this. You're saying this to God Almighty. You're saying theism is not scientific. Y'all are the ones that believe things can come from nothing. Now, if that were true, if we didn't believe that the first premise of the Kalam cosmological argument, that would be a science stopper, Dan. You must know this. What say you?
Well, now you have devolved into preaching and into ad hominem character attacks, trying to paint all atheists with the same brush. And if this is the kind of thing you're teaching in your history class, then you are a bad history teacher, because what you just said about the founders
So
is completely
let's stop
exaggerated.
here. Let's stop here because it's devolving into insults. So let's go back to what the idea was, right? So what is the idea that we're discussing?
So there's a brand new book coming out written by Andrew Seidel called The Founding Myth: Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American. And those facts that you just gave, purporting to be an American history teacher, are absolutely false. There's a little bit of truth in there, but you're right. Bad ideas can drive a person. And it appears to me that many theists, you brought this argument up, so I'm just responding to you. I agree with you, Andrew, the moderator, that this is off the table. But since Josh brought up ad hominem, and since Josh brought up motivations of us, I would say that I would suggest that you should take the beam out of your own eye before you try to take the mote out of mine. It goes both ways. So I referred to you to my argument, the cosmological calamity, showing that, in fact, the structure of the Kalam argument is illogical. Things come from nothing all the time. And in fact, the whole question of whether something comes from nothing is an incoherent question, because the word nothingness has never even been defined. So, I would suggest you, I'm sure you're a good guy. I'm sure you're a moral person. I'm sure, like most Christians, I think you do have good humanistic principles, and I applaud you for that. But the reasoning that you're referring to is just bad reasoning. And Bertrand Russell was right. It's basically bad grammar. And I wish there was a way to flip things around. I wish there was a way I could hand you the telescope and stop looking through the back end of it, turn it around and look through the right end of it. We atheists.
It was developed by a Christian.
Well, so what? So, there are things developed by, algebra is developed by a Muslim. So I suppose mathematics is Islamic. I mean, that's kind of silly.
They
Architecture.
weren't invented by atheists.
Well, what does that have to do? I mean, that's a fallacy.
Well, remember what I said that. Okay. Well, remember what one of my arguments was that the sciences in the Enlightenment, 51 of 52 of these notable names in the scientific revolution, these were Christians who believed that we could discover rational laws. It wasn't the atheists who built hospitals and libraries and universities. It was explicit Christians. And here's the fascinating thing, Dan. They actually discovered these laws. So, you combine that with all the arguments that I gave for the existence of God, and it makes a cumulative case for why one is justified in believing not just that God exists, but being an explicit Christian. Oh, and by the way, those ad hoc, if you look on the internet, you'll see all types of things from atheists saying that Christians have psychological motivations. Now, I want you, you brought up a number of things about American history. I want to go in that direction if we could, Dan.
So we're at about 15 minutes from our end time, so I would suggest that we spend the remainder sort of summarizing and capstoning what do you think the main thrust of your position and discussion has been so far, rather than going in detail into a subtopic.
Yeah, I think you're right. American history is interesting, but it's irrelevant. And the religious views of any particular discoverer are not really relevant to the discovery itself. And we do know, for example, that most scientists at the highest level, the Academy of Scientists, most of them do not believe in a God. They're not basing their observations and their hypotheses and their testing on somebody else's scripture. I'm certainly not. And I think it's amazing that there are wonderful Christians in the world. I mean, Christians are smart, and Christians they want to know about the real world as well. There are many great scientists who are Christian, but that does not connect the dots between their faith and their scientific discoveries.
Oh, I disagree.
So, well, you can disagree, but look, you do know that most scientists today in the academy are atheistic or agnostic today, and they're doing good science in spite of the Bible. And the Bible's precious to you, I'm sure, but it's not precious to everyone else.
You don't have to believe. You don't have to be a Bible literalist to believe that the Bible, and more generally the Christian conviction that God has made the world according to rational principles. Look at Francis Collins. Francis Collins, who helped get DNA. Well, I'm trying to formulate my words, but understand DNA. There's a Christian. There's a number of Christians. If you look on the internet, there is whole lists of explicit Christians. But one thing that is apparent, Dan, for the last generations, we've heard this so-called divide, this radical separation between theology and science. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the book by Andrew Dixon White.
Yeah. Yes, I am.
Okay. Andrew Dixon White. He wrote in 1896 a history of the warfare of science with theology in Christendom. Now, that was a caricature of Christianity and science. It's been refuted numerous times, but it has been influential in impacting our culture. So there's no real divide between science and theology, Dan.
Well, of course, I know there's a lot of good Christians who are good scientists. There's a lot of good atheists who are good scientists as well. But did a snake speak human language? Did food actually rain from the sky? Did the sun stand still? Is mental illness caused by demons? Is fertility caused by cows looking at a striped pole? Did a man walk on water unaided? And on and on and on. These claims that are made in the Bible these are non-scientific claims. And I think even you would agree that if you were to read a story like that written in any other holy book, you would say, well, that's metaphor or hyperbole. Those things really didn't happen. So the question of the existence of God is indeed a scientific question, because a universe with a God in it should look different from a universe without a
I
God in it.
disagree. I disagree. I don't think it's a scientific question. I'm not arguing for God of the gaps, Dan. I'm arguing a philosophical defense of what Christian theism is. Or science can help validate some of the premises in some of these philosophical arguments. For example, the beginning of the universe. But in and of themselves, I'm not arguing for God of the gaps. My argument is a cumulative philosophical argument. And by the way, when you look at those Bible verses, you can't look at them as a strict scientist or a verificationist. You have to look at them in their proper context, and that takes historical work and nuance, which is something I think a lot of atheists don't use when they go towards or to the biblical text.
So I disagree on both of those points very strongly. First of all, the question of the existence of God is indeed a scientific question. If there's a God, the universe would be different from if there was no God. The promises of the Bible would be fulfilled if the Bible were true, if there is a God. You would expect to be a statistically higher success rate to prayer if there is a God than if there is not. And you could measure those things.
That's a bad argument.
No, it isn't. The Bible says all things. What does the word all things mean? What kind of expert do you need to interpret the word all things? And if the Bible needs experts, then God was inept when he wrote it so that we can't understand it without somebody brilliant like Josh explaining to us. The Bible says all things whatsoever ye shall ask in prayer, believing, you shall receive. That's a very clear test. So let's look at that scientifically. We see that test fails. Scientifically, prayer does not work according to the way the Bible promises. So Josh, admit that. Admit that.
No,
prayer
I'm not going to admit
So
that.
you
once
have
again,
to admit it. I'm sorry.
Now, you guys, you got to calm down. You guys are going at each other too hard right now.
I apologize.
So let's take 30 seconds, not speaking, and then let's just summarize your points, okay?
And Andrew, you never made that. You never made that rule at the beginning that we could not calm down. Sometimes these debates can be heated, and sometimes they can be strong.
So Dan, this is my channel, and I'm suggesting this. If you don't want to end it on a summary, that's fine. We can end it right here.
Okay, bye. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. Wow.
I guess we touched a nerve. Well, everyone, go ahead, Josh.
No, well, I want to say that I do respect Dan. I do think these things can be contentious. I was hearing a lot of arguments that I would not buy into, that weren't philosophically plausible. I hope that we can have Dan on again. I think he's a great person, and sometimes these arguments can be contentious, but be that as it may, I definitely had fun.
Yeah. Well, everyone, I hope you enjoyed the discussion we had, and I suspect we're going to have a few chats about what was discussed in sort of a longer format too. And everyone have a wonderful Saturday, and God bless.
God bless.